watching the YouTube link.
Ok, buenos días a todos y a todas. La verdad es un placer contar con Lyndon Neri en este ciclo de charlas que hacemos desde el taller TAC de La Plata y el taller Explora de la Universidad de Buenos Aires. Siempre digo que estos efectos colaterales de la pandemia de golpe nos abrieron los ojos y nos permiten conectarnos con el mundo, cosa que también existía esa posibilidad, pero no sé por qué razón no la utilizábamos, y creo que a la larga esto nos va a hacer mejores como universitarios. Así que bienvenidos a este ciclo de charlas. Como les decía, está con nosotros Lyndon Neri, del estudio Neri and Who. Les voy a leer un poco un currículum reducido. Esta charla noche se va a traducir al castellano, online hasta el domingo a la noche, que vamos a tener que levantarla, cosa que ustedes tengan tiempo para verla, los que no pueden verla hoy a la noche o la que quieran volver a verla el fin de semana. Acá está con nosotros algunos de los profesores titulares, bueno, pues ya les presenté a Jaime Grimberg, Luis Bruno y otros profesores. Un anuncio pequeño, a las 11 de la mañana hay un consejo directivo que entendemos que es muy clave y es un hito un hito triste en nuestra facultad, pero que tiene que ver con la cuestión política académica de la destitución y la renuncia definitiva del decano, y entendemos que es bueno que se involucren, y los que quieran los invitamos a verlo, ya que en otros momentos estas cosas sucedieron y no se anunciaban, nos manteníamos fuera del ámbito político académico, y entendemos que es bueno que sepan y que vean lo que está sucediendo en la facultad. Bueno, les leo un poco la introducción del currículum de Lyndon Neri. Lyndon es el socio fundador de la oficina de diseño e investigación Neri and Who. Lyndon Neri cofundó Neri and Who Design and Research Office con Rosanna Hu en el año 2004. Es un estudio de diseño arquitectónico interdisciplinario con sede en Shanghai, China. A través de su práctica, Hu y Neri han reforzado una visión central: responder a una visión global del mundo que incorpora disciplinas de diseño superpuestas para un paradigma crítico de la arquitectura, mientras cree firmemente en la investigación como una herramienta de diseño, ya que cada proyecto tiene su conjunto único de problemas contextuales. Junto con su práctica de diseño, Neri ha estado profundamente comprometido con la educación arquitectónica. Ha dado conferencias en todo el mundo en varias universidades y foros profesionales. Neri fue nombrado crítico de diseño John C. Portman en la Universidad de Harvard en el año 2019 y recibió la distinguida cátedra Norman Foster Visiting Professor Chair de la Escuela de Arquitectura de Yale en 2010. También es fundador del Design Republic en Shanghái desde 2004, una plataforma de diseño que incorpora el concepto minorista, debe ser minimalista la traducción, el diseño, las exposiciones culturales y la educación. En el año 2015 fue nombrado director creativo de Stellar Works y ha sido miembro de la junta directiva del Roll and Hill en Brooklyn desde 2010. Nacido y criado en Filipinas, Neri recibió su maestría en arquitectura en la Escuela de Graduado de Diseño de la Universidad de Harvard y su licenciatura en arquitectura en la Universidad de California de Berkeley. La verdad son muchas páginas para poder leer su currículum de manera total, pero algunos hitos importantes pueden llegar a ser que trabajó desde el año 1994 hasta el 2004 en el estudio Michael Graves en Princeton. Como dijimos, se graduó en la Escuela de Diseño de Harvard y fue también profesor en la Escuela de Harvard y en la Escuela de Yale, y también profesor en la Universidad de Hong Kong. Tiene un sinfín de publicaciones, entre otras, los libros del año 2021, Espacio, Tiempo y Práctica, y otro que tiene que ver con su propia Oficina de Diseño e Investigación Neri Hu, Obras y Proyectos. Y también ganaron numerosos premios los últimos del Premio Festival de Diseño de Madrid y premio en el 2018 de diseño de Blueprint, bueno, y un montón de premios más que por supuesto los pueden ver en su página web. So we are very, very thank you to have you here, Lyndon. We are really honored to have you here. We leave you with the lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alejandro, Daniel, for this, for the kind introduction. Maybe I should start by saying buenos dias. Buenos dias, everyone. That's my last Spanish I'm going to say. The title here, it says Neri and Who Work in Permanent Evolution. This is in relationship to a particular exhibition that we just finished last month, and a lecture commemorating sort of our work of 15 years. And so we thought maybe using this as a way to capture this moment in time of our practice. And I'm extremely delightful that I could be here again, despite the pandemic, to be able to address some of the issues that we're dealing with as a practice, to a group of architects that's so far away from us. I want to thank the University of Buenos Aires, University of Las Platas, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and of course you, Alejandro, for this invitation tonight, my time, morning, your time. We are a firm based in Shanghai, and I want to show you a particular our project, our office, just to give you a context of where we come from. So the place we come from set the stage for many of our architectural and design explorations. We want to share that condition with you tonight, your morning, as a contextual framework from which to understand the way we work and our operative modes as architects, interior designers, product designers, graphic designers. So we bring forth a number of issues that initially started as real problems that we had to confront with while working on many various projects. And they became obsessions over time that kept coming back. Now, these obsessions, we can't obviously talk about all the obsessions tonight. I'm going to talk about 3 of them. There is a book coming out, a second monograph of our work, where 7 of these issues, pressing issues that we have to deal with, are all in it. For tonight, due to time limitation, I am going to share 3 of them. But before I do that, I want to talk about the context where we're practicing. Perhaps it's an oversimplification of what we call the China condition. But I think for someone who is so far away that is not aware of or familiar with Asia in general, and maybe China specific, and to a certain degree, Shanghai as a city, I want, just for the sake of this, for a sake of clarity, that perhaps I can address these issues so you will understand the problems we're dealing with. So the urban issues we have to deal with, which is the development and demolition, the rural issues, which deals with the disappearing village, the remnants of China's industrial heritage. So when we talk about urban issues, we know in China, I'm not overstating it, but the idea of the rapid development and demolition is a real problem. If you look at these 2 images, which was very interesting, Nadav Kandar, an amazing photographer, depict sort of the condition, the dense condition of the city where we, the many different cities in China that have this kind of development. Jia Zhangke, a filmmaker, to the right, talks about the idea of this disparity between what is commonly seen as a beautiful field of perhaps a landscape at a certain moment with major growth of the city next to it. If you look at Chongqing, for instance, as a city, major highway overpass that are constantly being built as we speak. In that case, urbanization changes the landscape and it alters the texture of our daily life. giving rise to the new notion of urban leisure. You can imagine weekend people actually coming to be underneath these hovering superimposed highway that sort of hovers on top of once a beautiful kind of waterway that they used to enjoy. And that became kind of a normal situation. When we talk about rural issue, a while ago, we talked about city and urban. With rural issue, the idea of disappearing villages is a constant problem. Vernacular villages that were formed based on Confucian ideals are now all of a sudden disappearing because not so much it's being demolished, but because people leave villages and they go to the city. And so by virtue of that, many of these conditions or many of these villages are left with only older generations together with kids that normally do not go back. So here it's sort of a pandemic of sort, maybe a cultural pandemic. If you look at this particular image, each empty chair representing an absent family member who has left the village to pursue opportunities in urban areas. So by doing this, you can imagine no one really comes back, and you can kind of imagine that the city as a whole or the village as a whole kind of disappear. The third condition that we have to deal with is adaptive reuse and dealing with the constant excess. So many of our projects fall under this category. We have to deal with local history and heritage. So in much of our work, there's this recurrent theme of dealing with old and new, reinterpreting what is local typology, and also finding what is new and celebrate, trying to find a new way of celebrating the everyday, the mundane neighborhood that you see today. In a week's time could be demolished. The context that you were working around, all of a sudden after your new building is built, no longer is there. So how do we deal with that when context is no longer relevant? In fact, we were a victim, as I was telling a group of you a while ago, of this a few years ago when we were evicted of our office 10 years for 10 years. We were there for 10 years, and all of a sudden, within 3 months, we were asked to leave. So this is the context in which Neri and Hu intentionally situates ourselves. As a practice, we are constantly trying to insert meaning into our work by drawing from these contexts, both in geography and history. For that, we often find ourselves looking at the past. In other words, working with this notion, which is going to be my first obsession that I'm going to talk about, the idea of nostalgia. So today, I'm going to break it down to 3 different obsessions. The first one, we're going to talk about reflective nostalgia. The second one, we're going to talk about recasting vernacular, not just typology, but also materiality. And obviously, the third, talking about the past, talking about the current, and obviously talking about the future, which deals with the future artifacts. So what is reflective nostalgia? One with us, and many of you that probably have heard Rosanna and I give lecture in the past have probably seen this within the context of sort of our framework of argument. But let's take a moment to look at this word nostalgia. The word is a Greek compound word consisting of nostos, meaning homecoming, and algos, meaning pain or ache. Coined around the end of the 17th century, as a medical term, nostalgia was thought to be a disease. Yeah? So think of it as maybe another type of a potential COVID condition because people didn't really know. It was only towards the first half of the 19th century that nostalgia began to attain its current meaning, the one we understand and use it today. So people used to see it as a disease. Yeah, nostalgia was never seen as the way we understand it today. It was considered a disease since they saw soldiers and sailors who, after leaving their homeland, began to manifest symptoms such as fainting, high fever, and even death, all later attributed to other physical illness. It was other physical illness that caused them to be sick and caused them to die, but people thought it was nostalgia. Now commonly known as sentimentality of the past, it should be noted that the object of longing is transferred from the concreteness of place to the invariably abstract notion of time. Time being irreversible, the past being forever past, nostalgia can only be defined as the presence of an absence. Let me repeat that. Nostalgia can only be defined as the presence of an absence. So in the image here to the left is an image of a great German photographer who was based himself in Hong Kong, a guy called Michael Wolfs. Here it captures the alarming trend of urbanization producing anonymous cities and the disappearance of local personality. This happens in Asia. If you look at the images to the left, you can't tell if it's Bangkok, Shanghai, or Hong Kong, right? The cosmopolitan of the commonly term called central business district, where housing and office comes together, be it gleaming tower or concrete jungles. It has that same anonymous feel. And yet the image to the right is a typical Shanghai Nongtang alleyway, remnants of Shanghai old city fabric where we believe life actually happens. This is where things become different. If you go to Bangkok, that condition on the street front is very much different from the one that you experience in Shanghai. The Hong Kong streetscape, which is kind of hilly, will be very different from flat Beijing, for instance. But if you were to look at the left, that would be what you would see from the air. But when, in fact, when you come to the street life, the one to the right, that's where life actually happened. That's where we start differentiating ourselves. So if we were to look at Aldo Rossi's argument in the architecture of the city, it offers us a hint when he articulates memory as a flaw and the past and the future of the city as a flow. But are we being too naive? Is this over nostalgic, longing for something that must go away, holding on to romantic notion of the past that may have never existed? Or perhaps there is another argument to this idea of nostalgia. Is nostalgia just all about the past? Is it all just about history? It was then that Rosanna and I came upon this reading by Svetlana Boym, a Harvard educator. Unfortunately, she passed away about 5 years ago, on the book called The Future of Nostalgia. And in the book, it talks about two types of nostalgia. And this is where there was this epiphany that came to us when we were doing our first project. Because in this nostalgia, these two types of nostalgia, when you talk about restorative and reflective nostalgia, you realize that there is a difference, that perhaps what Aldo Rossi is talking about is not so much restorative nostalgia. And if you were to look at this, restorative nostalgia is more literal and a direct by comparison. It attempts a trans-historical reconstruction of the lost home and does not think itself as nostalgia, rather as truth and tradition. In many ways, if you look at Disneyland today, that's kind of a restorative nostalgia when they try to bring and mimic a certain image of Paris, a certain image of a particular city, and recreate it and make it like as if it's part of the truth and tradition. We, however, believe and are convinced that what Svetlana talks about, which is this notion of reflective nostalgia, is something that actually could be quite helpful. It thrives on the longing itself and delays the homecoming. Wistfully and ironically, desperately, it does not follow a single plot, but explores ways of inhabiting many places at once and imagining different time zones. It loves details, not symbols. Perhaps it's the essence of the experience, the things around you when you were growing up, the essence and the spirit of the past that might inform us. So with that, let me show you our first project. This was actually our first architectural project, two very early work in the Lane House of Shanghai. And you know that these Lane houses has been demolished. So with the vein of sort of reflective nostalgia, I kind of want to show you a very small domestic project that we started around 15 years ago. And it dealt with the idea, if you look at the typology of these lane houses, sectionally, it's really quite powerful. There's the public component to the right, and to the left, the smaller rooms that are actually in different levels from the main room. So the main room, the first floors always have this high ceiling, and there's always this intermediate stair that connects them. So our strategy in this particular project was to rethink the typology of this lane house that's been long gone, keeping the split level formation and add spatial interest through new insertion and a skylight that celebrate the architectural integrity of such typology. So we were fortunate enough to be given a commission when we were a young practice, or relatively young practice, maybe about 15 years ago. And so we thought we really wanted to preserve this. Many people would demolish the sort of interior and have a completely different configuration. And so what we did was we decided, why don't we just keep the sort of integrity of this particular type and insert a new metal stairway that leads and connects sort of that split level. It was an interesting client who actually wanted to find himself. He came and said, I'm gonna come from Hong Kong to Shanghai once a month, and I want to charge you with this commission to be able, through architecture, to find myself, to find history. His father was from Shanghai, and he married someone from Hong Kong, and he decided, like me and my two friends, will be able to try to find myself within the context of perhaps the most intense, historically preserved area of Shanghai. So he bought this house. It was extremely dilapidated because the stairways were already rotten. So we inserted this new metal stairway. And you can kind of sort of see sort of this insertion of what we were trying to do. Sorry, I'm just, did I miss the front facade? And so you see what we're trying to do, a very simple insertion, but what's interesting about this is the front facade disappearing here. I don't know what happened. So the bathrooms here, I'm sorry guys, I think what's important is I just think we just missed the facade. Oh, we got it. Okay, hold on. All right, no worries. No problemas. Okay, so the bathroom here, conceivably the most intimate spaces of each apartment, are inserted next to the most public stairway, separated only with a sandblasted glass divider. So you can kind of see what we kind of did, this kind of crazy idea of having the most public stairway and put it next to the most private, extremely voyeuristic. And we, of course, we're not that crazy. We suggested to have curtains, but then he told me that, he says, no, me and my two friends are going to live like this. And of course, he lives on the 3rd floor, so he doesn't have to worry. His two friends needs to deal with sort of their nakedness in front of him. But it was this crazy idea, but it's not so much this. We decided to say, what if we decide to actually bring the neighborhood back into this lane house? And so you could kind of see sort of the idea of framing of the neighbor, every floor having kind of a different snippet of what it is. The performative nature of this borrowed view is now considered here. A thinking that is perhaps ambiguous at that time, but now is actually rather clear. So this cinematic experience where in space is not a result of a static representation, but a mobile element in constant mutation, and this idea that the neighborhood is brought into the house. And so you sort of see what we're trying to do. I always thought of Eliason's words, the great artist, when he says, visitors, physical moving through its convoluted and intricately linked spaces. So this is in many ways our own chance of bringing the architectural promenade, which strings together a series of views combined with the movement of the body. So architecturally, the decorative articulation added over the last 60 years were stripped off, and large openings were created on the front elevation to improve light qualities to the more public rooms of each floor. It is as if we slice off 60 years and now forces the building to embrace its community without a mass, without a facade, literally. Urbanistically, it is reshaping the lane house typology with the transparency and modernity that fulfills a contemporary vitality. Sadly enough, after we finished this project, in many ways, this was the same as our Waterhouse project. The client passed away rather young, so now it's still there, but it serves sometimes as a cafe, sometimes it becomes a retail store. Over the last 15 years, it has changed, but you can kind of see sort of the vitality of this lane house still stayed intact, and within the community became quite interesting. The second project I want to show you within the vein of a reflective nostalgia is a project we called Waterhouse. This was completed about 10 years ago. And when a client came to us and asked us to do a project on the Bund, for those of you that have been in Shanghai, when you say the Bund, there's only 33 buildings on the Bund, 33, yeah? And so of course my ego thinks, wow, I'm gonna do one of those 33. Well, I was wrong. It was south of the Bund. So this was given to me, and I looked at this building and I'm thinking to myself, what happened to those glorious Bund days? Well, it was the south of the Bund. It was an existing 3-story which was once a Japanese police headquarters. Initially, my first thought was, well, if I can demolish this and start new, all architects think that. You have to remember, this is the context we were dealing with. To the right, you have all these smaller houses. But the client said something which made me nervous. He says, I want to do something that looks, I want a building that looks like London, Mayfair. And I said, why would you want to do that? Of course, my first shock was the fact that I'm not doing the 31 of the 33 buildings on the Bund, but my next shock was even greater, which was to do a project in Mayfair, to do a project that looks like Mayfair, London. So I decided, no, this is not going to happen. I'm going to try to keep this building as much as I want. So of course, I told the client, look, if you save this building, you will actually save a lot of money. So for those of you Argentinian architects, if you guys want to do or deal with Chinese developers or client, just say it's cheaper and they will give you the project. Okay, so that's what I did. So this was over 10 years ago. I decided, why don't we just keep this? And I was really intrigued. We were intrigued by Calvino's quote in dealing with the idea of a traveler, because a traveler actually finds something amazing within the city that he or she is in, that oftentimes someone who's living there for a long time might not recognize. So this was very important to us. Programmatically, this was to be a boutique hotel. We start thinking not so much about hotels, but about traveling, how travelers find familiarities in foreign lands, how nostalgia, the longing of the past, is at the very root of traveling. So these were some of the sketches, some of my sketches, a little bit different from what it is now. And so this is that image of Waterhouse, of old and new, dealing with the idea of public and private. So the architectural concept behind this renovation, you can kind of see clear, rests on clear contrast of what is old and new. And this is the main entrance. You can imagine sort of the shock of the many people when this opened. China and all its developers and clients wants everything bling, everything new. And we presented something like this 11 years ago. We come in and we said, look, let's preserve the lobby. And you can imagine even my mother was shocked. So the first time I brought my parents over, I remember my mother asking me 2 questions. First, is this project complete? Is this done? Son, you went to Harvard to study architecture. Is this called architecture? Is this complete? And I said, yes, it is. His second question was, she asked, did the client pay you? I said, they did. And so she said, well, you're either extremely smart or the client is really stupid and crazy. So you can imagine, I'm not even trying to convince the Chinese community, the community that we are based in, but I'm also trying to convince my parents. So in this particular case, when we're trying to do this, actually, it's not so much about a strategy, but it is really a conviction. The conviction that just because it's old doesn't mean that it automatically needs to demolish. That the blurring of the interior and the exterior is very much a Shanghai condition. The in-between interstitial spaces are realms that can create disorienting yet refreshing journey, that you can find meaning and purpose in these interstitial spaces. We saw this as providing a uniquely Shanghai experience, and at the same time an experience that is very similar to the lane houses that you see in the neighborhood. Because if you are in the neighborhood, and I live in a lane house, and what happened is I have this big window because I'm a modernist in my bathroom, and if I don't pull my curtain out, my neighbor she's already in her 80s, she would see me naked. So this is part of life here in Shanghai, the close proximity of this whole voyeuristic nature. So here you can kind of see from the ramps that moves up and down the atrium space, the guests would gain unconventional interior perspective into the rooms. It was important, this particular sketch, using the recycled wood from above, from the roof, making it into louvers. The public spaces allow one to peek into private rooms. This is a bedroom above, looking down. This is the cheapest bedroom, by the way. 19 rooms is the cheapest bedroom because it faces the concierge, not the concierge, the reception, basically reminding you that you have to always pay. So it's interesting that these visual connection of unexpected spaces not only bring an element of surprise, but also force the guest to confront the local urban condition, where visual corridors and adjacency in tight lane houses define our unique daily experience. This is the experience my kids grew up in. Many of my relatives have these kind of conditions. Many of my peers have these kind of conditions in which there is that sectional quality. If you look at the restaurant, to the left, that image is a view to the street. To the right is the courtyard. So the restaurant actually is floating above. There's a slit that looks up to the room. This is the slit that looks up to the room. And so from the bedroom, you actually can see the restaurant down below. The client thought we were crazy. I said, you don't need artwork anymore. The people that come to your restaurant is your artwork. So in many ways, it is part of life. This is not a mirror. These are two bedrooms that you actually look across. And we use reflective stainless steel as the louvers that allowed you to see the activities in the courtyard. These sort of spatial relationships are quite intense. Bedrooms are done in which you share balconies within rooms. The roughness, the patina that comes with the project, the idea of retaining the quality. The image to the right is a room down below on the second floor looking up to our third floor, wherein there is that sectional quality. And obviously, we played with graphics as well, and we start introducing some of our favorite restaurants, favorite places to go in the hotel. Sectionally, you can kind of see some of the existing sort of stairway that leads to different places. We actually kept it intact. We made visual connection of unexpected spaces, not only help to one to discover and explore, but also in many ways, getting lost. Getting lost while traveling is perhaps one of the most fun. So we figure if you get lost in your hotel, it's the beginning of sort of this notion of travel. And so you see some of the stairs leading to nowhere. They stop in midair, just like the way it is. Here it is, the project possesses memories of the city that would have otherwise been demolished. If no new life or new program was brought to the building, now this part of the waterfront represents an alternative to the conventional preservation without exactly freezing time, but building on layers of what used to be there, materials, surfaces, spaces, light, memories, and creating a uniquely new identity. We have a film we want to show you. As a practice, we have, as a practice, we have consciously made an effort to film all our work, because a lot of times, many of you or people that are not living in China don't get a chance to see architecture in a three-dimensional or experience it in a three-dimensional way. And I believe architecture should be experienced through space. Oftentimes drawing is not enough. Perspective is not enough. And so we try now, this is not perfect, certainly. It's not perfect, but at least it gives you an idea of sort of how spaces are very important to us. we took the elements of the streets, the brick pavers, and actually brought it in to the lobbying, brought it into the restaurants, brought it to the elevator cab that lifts you up. This image is actually quite indicative of how close we are to the Huangpu River. It's a living river to this day. And so that's how close we are in the room. And in many ways, the hotel is not just about a view to the picturesque, a view of something of the grandeur of Shanghai, but it's a combination of both. The beautiful Pudong skyline, if you consider that beautiful, because I certainly don't, or perhaps the grit and the grime of the Huangpu River that actually talks about the life of the city. And the history and the patina and layers of this were really kept intact. And so there was really a blurring of the old and new, a blurring of sort of these kind of conditions. And we kept things quite authentic in terms of material. And by experiencing this, you really find the idea of the lane houses within our city and urban fabric, albeit done in a vertical manner, to be quite clear and represented in this project. So when we did this project, it was important for us that people don't come to this hotel with a tourist in mind, but rather the notion of a traveler. And what is a traveler is to find the essence of what traveling and the essence of the city. So the second issue I want to talk about is recasting vernacular. We talked about reflective nostalgia. The second issue is recasting vernacular. Again, my apologies. The second monograph that comes out will have 7 issues, but for tonight, due to time, I'm only going to talk about 3 issues. So Nihal Pereira talks about the idea of transforming Asian city, of finding that third space, stepping outside of the positive epistemological structures, learning from the past, the locals and distant cultures, displacing the idea of the East-West commonly seen in sort of our mindset, local, global, and modern traditional binaries. The critical vernacularists have produced third spaces for the creation and expression of local modernities. What is this third space? What is at stake for architecture today in relationship to identity? We're in a globalized world, and the digital age have radically altered the conventional notions of local versus global, center versus periphery. What form can critical regionalism, a concept popularized by Kenneth Frampton, take on today's architecture that diverges from an ethnocentric view of regional modern expressions as inherently working against the core, or perhaps the imagined core, of Western hegemony? Is it possible to arrive at an architecture that is rooted in the particularities of place, yet also transcends its local, to resonate a sense of universality? This is a question we have to deal with, a question we're trying to address with the issue of recasting vernacular. So we pose these questions because as our practice evolved, the Chinese economy shifted in developing inland provinces and rural areas. This image, by the way, is a map of vernacular architecture in China. Very interesting. It's actually an image that talks about different ways. If you look at the map and how many different sort of vernacular typology are so different from the north, south, all the way down to the middle of China. So can one really represent the whole country? Our argument, no. Our project, as well as many in our circle of architect friends, have expanded in recent years from urban centers to the rural periphery in China. We adapted our approach to finding modern expression for an architecture that is contemporary, yet being mindful of the inseparable relationship to local specificity, materials, and topography. So you will see in many of our projects, it's not just about the vernacular in terms of typology, but vernacular in terms of materiality. But before we go there, I want to show you a work of an artist by named Michael Lin. Actually originally written in Spanish by Mexican composer Maria Grever in 1934. The song "What a Difference a Day Made" was also known as, now I'm gonna try to pronounce this in Spanish, I don't know if I can, but "Cuando vuela a tu lado," right? I think maybe some of you know that song. Artist Michael Lin, inspired by Wong Kar-wai Chungking Express, which also featured this song, titled this exhibition after this love song. Chungking Express is a tour de force that speaks of the complexity of a post-colonial subject. So one day in 2008, Lin bought out the entire content of an everyday goods store in Shanghai. So he would go to a regular store in Shanghai with all this plastic bin, the plastic buckets, the wok, the broom, and every bowl, plate, and pot. He then relocated them to the Shanghai Gallery of Art, which is it's on 3 in the Bund, designed by Michael Graves, and form an art installation. And all of a sudden, what was a common mundane thing is now celebrated. And so David Chang wrote, which was interesting, to speak about Shanghai is like talking about a film that is still rolling. It is somewhere between imagination and reality, a pure spectacle that thrives on itself in order to fill its own sense of void. The coexistence of what is vernacular, utopic, dystopic of the city provides us with a contradictory backdrop. After the initial delight of discovery, Shanghai manifests a perpetual amnesia, which continues until an instance where you are completely neutralized, taking it all in whether you like it or not. Where is the vernacular in this particular show? You ask yourself. Is it possible to preserve a spatial and temporal history, something lived and living? What a difference a day made here. In many ways, one can say it can be no difference. Maybe there is no difference. And yet it could be all the difference in the world. It really depends on you. So you have to go through that experience yourself. As you deal with sort of this vernacular experience, perhaps you said this is part of the everyday, or perhaps it could be celebrated in a different way. So you can kind of see what was seen before in a store that is seen as cheap is now all of a sudden glorified in over a day. It became different. It became part of the museum process. So we at Nirinhu have also researched into vernacular typologies. This was a research in a paper that we presented in ARC Asia in Thailand, understanding how to tie our project into a broader cultural lineage. Our major source of inspiration is obviously the lane houses in this particular case. As I have shown you already a while ago with Waterhouse and the Split House, we are fascinated by that blur boundaries of domesticity and the notion of home, as well as communal living through many of their overlapping spaces. But it's more than that. And it is about the understanding of movement, vernacular movement within an interior space, vernacular typology that dictates that. So if you go to Beijing, it's lane houses, it's courtyard houses, sorry. If you're here in Shanghai, it's lane houses. In Xiamen, down south, it's these round tulo houses. So these are very different. So with that in mind, I'm gonna show you a project that deals with vernacular materiality. All right, so this is a project in Suzhou, which is about 2 hours away from Shanghai, a place in the vicinity of Jiangnan, literally meaning south of the Yangtze River. It is situated next to a famous scenic lane. In this particular project, we are actually looking at something quite interesting. We were looking at the materiality and investigating of perhaps how do we use old recycled materials, using that recycled material and juxtapose it with new materials, perhaps using the idea of the ink brushes by a famous artist, the idea that perhaps these traditional ink brush strokes with watercolor will create a new way of representation that is not seen before. Can this be translated into architecture with the use of materiality? These were some of the sketches. This is a non-denominational chapel in China. When it's called a chapel, it's really for wedding. Most of the time, we were asked to do a chapel inside housing development. So these are the models. Sectionally, it's on a very different stage, sort of the topographic. It goes down to this waterway. So what we did was we did sort of this pathway that leads you up before you enter the main sanctuary. So the walls that are made from reclaimed bricks begin with a refined scales for different heights interweaved to create a choreographed landscape journey leading into the building itself. These bricks are all recycled. If you look at the floor plan, there is an adjoining stairway actually that leads you to the garden above. Sectionally, it is a house within a house, and you will see it later, what that looks like. Sectionally of that stairway is equally important. Unfortunately, the drawing does not really depict the detail notion of that particular stair. So this is that stairway that leads you up sectionally, different qualities that allows you to bring you up, not just to the mezzanine level, but also brings you up to the rooftop. And the mezzanine level hovers overhead to accommodate extra guests and includes a catwalk encircling the space, allowing that sort of view to the chapel above. It's all in wood, this caging. And so you sort of see this particular moment in time from the back of the structure. You actually can see sort of the brick wall that meander from the front all the way to the end that leads you to the garden. Tectonically, that white volume is a metal louvered screen. It is actually, it acts like a layer around a concrete structure. In the daytime, the white box shimmers gently in the sunlight, exposing its content. So at night, the white box becomes this jewel-like beacon in the neighborhood. Here, I'm going to show you a film. In this particular project, what is recasting vernacular? The notion of recasting vernacular deals with using this particular Jiangnan's way of construction, a way of using a particular material that is common in this particular area, and to reintroduce a recycled, repurposed material, forming it as a base, and on top of it sits this new sort of modern, almost lantern-like structure that sits on top of the recycling brick. This is very short. This is usually a longer film, but for this particular lecture, we made it short because I have more projects to show you. So the next project is a project called Yangzhou Retreat, still within that vein of recasting vernacular, except instead of materiality, now we're dealing with typology. So this is the site we were given next to the slender West Lake. The program was to design a 20-room wellness retreat. The site has been dilapidated for a very long time. Before starting, we studied some of the vernacular conditions. There were traditional clusters of courtyards, and some hybrid transformation through the years resulted from functional needs and variations. And in that particular, we walk around the city and visited a nearby relic, an important garden called Geyuan. And so you actually see all these beautiful walls around the city. And this is that garden that I talked about with a mansion in front. It's a private garden built by a salt merchant. Like many other classical Chinese garden, Geyuan is a manifestation of the Taoist ideal of being one with nature. But more than that, there is this house in front, and the house is gridded. And let me just show you that image. Yeah, here it is. This was in the middle of the city, one of the biggest sort of house in front of the garden. That has courtyard that looks up to the beautiful sky, and you can kind of see how this beautiful sort of residential complex with corridors that also acts as fire lanes, because when you have double brick walls, it becomes sort of that divider to stop the spread, or at least limit the spread of fire. So we thought that was interesting because this resort is really only about 10 minutes away from the city. So we said, if we cannot touch the footprint, perhaps the adaptive reuse of several older buildings, which was required of us to keep, how do we use a strategy to overcome this existing condition? So you see, this was the condition we were given, a remnant with beautiful lake on the site. And so we said to ourselves, what if we had to keep the footprint? How do we align the building? And so we created this kind of grid-like structure that is very similar to the structure that you saw, the typology that you saw in this city, many of the housing conditions there. And we thought to ourselves, wow, that would be interesting if we start creating this grid. The grid becomes that passageway, and obviously keeping some of the existing building and some of the newer buildings are inserted in. So you see that building as it's built today with the grid in front. You can imagine when it was going through tender stages, the client called me and says, can we not have the wall? It's costing me, the wall itself costing me $1 million more. And you can imagine the project without the wall is a dead project conceptually. Yes, it's only a corridor. He says, it's only a corridor. Why do you spend so much money? So I had to fly to Beijing and convince him and told him, you really, if you take the wall, it's like taking my heart and taking my soul. You've just killed me. And so he panicked. He went out smoking. I gave him about 30 minutes. He came back and he says, okay, I'll build you the wall. But what we did was we did a bargain. I said, look, the rooms will be cheaper. I'll make a cheaper room for you for the hotel. Just create this wall. So these are some of the construction photo. Many of the building roof lines are confined within the height of the walls, just low enough so that they are not visible from the compound outside. So you see sort of that grid and the footprint. You know, in China, the footprints are kept so that people actually, the government actually had a survey. So during construction, they want to make sure you're surveying so that you don't change your footprint. So we actually pass this sort of test. So from this aerial view, we see a clear orthogonal orientation. The planning department mandated that we only build on the existing footprint. Imagine how difficult that is if I didn't have this gridded pattern. So as a strategy, we formed this covered walkway, as I told you, based on the idea of the vernacular typology of the city, 10 minutes away. It becomes the organizer. It also guides circulation and defines and wraps the buildings within. And so you sort of see the spirit of this vernacular typology, but it also creates something entirely contemporary and unique, something belonging to both the past and brings us to the future. So this is the first entry, the brick circulation. This was before, just after the construction, so the vegetation is not full yet. Right now it's like a jungle because it's like so full with trees. And you see sort of the waterways. You arrive at the reception court. These were some of the construction photos of that project. The entry and the check-in condition, so you actually contained it. And so we also had a great opportunity to do, we love to design furniture, but the client insists that we work with a rural carpenter. And you can imagine they don't really look at drawings and they just use wood combines that were so thick and we're not used to it. And we have to deal with bended metal by hand and not by machine. But it was actually quite interesting. We actually worked with them, worked with a local bricklayer. And in that roughness, by celebrating that roughness, we actually find kind of a new way of making things. These are some of the existing structure that we kept. But by cutting a particular section, it starts to change the way you look at vernacular, yet preserving a part of history that you can reflect on. Some of the rooms, you can see sort of have that sense of privacy. Furniture are spare. You have to remember we had to spend that money on the wall, and so therefore not a lot of money were on the, we still have a bed though. So if you come and stay, there is still a bed for you to stay on. But you can kind of see also what is noteworthy is that we employed recycled brick like the previous project as a cladding material. We collect these from demolition sites around the region and reassemble them in various bond patterns. The brick wall added textural reading, and over time, their patina continues to build. And so you see sort of construction images, the pathway that leads you up. This is the view. Sorry, I'm moving this rather fast because I have 2 other projects, and once the 2 project is over, it's going to be done. But I figure you guys are Spanish and Argentinian, so you know you take your time. So I figure I take my time as well. So I want to show you the image of this particular project. How come it's not moving? Oh, it's moving. So again, this is a project right after construction. So you still see like kind of bare. This is the auditorium, but right now it's really full. This was the first project that we actually dealt with landscape and architecture. We also made a concerted effort the last 5 years to really do projects in the rural area, not just in the city, because we believe that the component and the fabric of the rural region in China are equally important. And the client, this particular client, believes that, oh, it got stuck. So anyways, he believes that some of these sites, that you can't just be preserving the Great Wall or Summer Palace, but the smaller spaces in the rural area, the vicinity, the beautiful lakes also are worth preserving, and we actually resonate with it. So the last issue we want to talk about is future artifacts. So we began this lecture with reflective nostalgia, with the idea of the past, focusing on projects that adapt found artifacts seen as fragments in time and imparting new life through our design intervention. So in this last chapter, I want to talk about the future, specifically the future artifact. We circled back to connect our present moment to the past, but simultaneously shift the lens to the future. Naturally, as a practice, we're only not dealing with old buildings. More and more, we're getting new projects, and not just projects in China. We actually have 8 projects in Europe right now, 2 in the US. So now more specifically, we're dealing with projects that deals with from ground up. So how do we deal with this? The notion of the monument and the conceptual framework presented in this chapter builds on the theories of Aldo Rossi, who conceived the city as a living entity, constantly transforming and accumulating its own memory. So while we might not necessarily have buildings that we can hold on to, older buildings, there are still memories that we can work around. Rossi argued that architecture's value resides within the forms of urban artifacts, which continue to structure the city even after they have shed their function. So I think a lot of you are very familiar with this particular image, but you know, it's kind of interesting. So Aldo Rossi is the architecture of the city. The image on the left is the cover of the 4th Italian edition of Rossi's Architecture of the City. Peter Eisenman wrote the introduction and summarizes the ambivalent nature of Rossi's work. This image, a horizontal section of the mausoleum of Hadrian in Rome, reads as a spiral, which is associated with the labyrinth built by the Greek mythology architect Daedalus. Eisenman's interpretation is that Daedalus represents the symbol par excellence of the humanist architect, an analogy for Rossi, whose argument for a new model to the city was seen as a critic of the modern movement and its failed urban utopia. What is interesting to note, however, in Eisenman's interpretation of the dual symbolism of the labyrinth is this. One, in terms of the spiral as a mausoleum, in many ways it represents a symbolic place of death, a sense of finality, right? You're going down this spiral to a place where you're gonna be, your body is finally coming to an end. But on the other hand, it also represents that of humanism, wherein the spiral also represents transformation. So it depends on how you see it. Perhaps it's a way of death and finality, but also at the same time, that sort of circular motion brings you back and transform you to something else. So in this chapter, we will look at two works that have challenged us with alternative notion of context. Context that is no longer that we are used to, the role of the monument and the duality of destruction and evolution. So as Eisenman pointed out, the link between death, finality, and transformation will go hand in hand. And in many ways, it is not so straightforward, I would argue. And so this is a particular image that you see if you come to the city, not so much now, but when we came here and started our practice about 15 years ago, it's the word destroy, or to destruction, or to destroy, demolish, sorry, the word demolish, not destroy, to demolish. So it's to demolish the building, and the idea that, you know, it is not a question of if, but when. Today's newly buildings will become another architect's ruin. So if you can imagine the idea that a lot of our building today will one day be a ruin. So we ask a simple question: how do we build with a meaningful presence for the future? Because no matter how new our building is, even Le Corbusier or Louis Kahn, many of these buildings one day will become a ruin. And so how do we propose this? How do we build a building with that in mind? Again, I go back to the image of Nadav Kandar that I talked about. This image taken between 2005 to 2007 captures some of the rapid changes in China built environment. And if you look at Jia Zhangke's documentary, to the right, it captures a portrait of Shanghai as it undergoes transformation before the World Expo of 2010. This was just 11 years ago, guys. So New York Times wrote, Manolha Darkis wrote this, which I thought was really quite interesting when they saw this image. This isn't just a vivid snapshot of a contemporary city in transition. It is also an entire history distilled in one extraordinary image. You see new, you see old, you see demolition, you see tradition, right? So in many of Jia Zhangke's layer, it's so rich, it tells you something. It's so critical. Is it death or is it transformation? Is it part of the past or is it a possibility for the future? And so I find many of these questions to be quite endearing, also quite interesting, to start dig deeper into the possibility of what ruins is. If you look at the Roman ruins, you know, if you really, the Western notion of the Western ruin is quite romantic. It's always associated with something physical, something aesthetic. And to the left, you see it. To the right, the image that shows the Chinese notion of ruin is less overtly tied to visual remnants, but invoked through absence, voids, and the imagery, in this particular case, of an ancient tree. So if you look at Japan's history, some of the historical building, when they burned down, they don't treat it like the Venetian, the way they built it, exact brick by brick. No, they understand the essence of it. They built it. The form might be different. Sectionally, it might have a little bit essence of what it is, but it is the spirit, perhaps through the absence, through the void, or perhaps a particular image that they depict that starts to see the possibility of ruin and a possibility of this connection. So with that in mind, I want to show you a competition that we recently won. Very interesting project. It's for Pernod Ricard, French with a wine, not so much a wine. It's a brand. It's a fairly big. It has a lot of wine. It creates wine and distillery and whiskey. And what it wants to do is it wants to create a new Chinese whiskey. And so for this competition, we actually use the nature to be our primary inspiration. Here, there's no more buildings, so we decided this is a site in Emeisan, actually to use this particular site as an inspiration it used landscape, and also to use history and perhaps the idea of these contradicting words. So in Chinese, there are many words that are contradictory in nature, and yet together they form another meaning. Something that is very simple. Let me take the word mountain and water. Something is very hard and something is very soft and fluid. But these two words are very different, but when they're put together, it means landscape. So it's quite interesting. So we decided, what if our project is all about that? What if we're dealing with a landscape, but we still have to do a distillery that requires a huge sort of building structure? How do we mitigate this too? Emeisan is a place in Sichuan that is steeped in Buddhist culture. How do we bring alcohol with a very steep, highly religious place? It's almost sinful to do that. And yet, by creating this duality, perhaps we can find something new, something fresh out of this. So the problem of lacking context, perhaps dealing with the future, made us rely simply on the site itself in a purest sense, surrounded on three sides by the winding creek. You will see in this particular rendering, with a direct vista to the peak of Emeisan. The topography of the land gradually steps with agricultural terraces. Some are also dramatic and breathtaking, with steep rock facing the water's edge. This creates very interesting pathway routes and a constantly changing relationship with both mountain and the stream. The journey blends view of the mountain and perspective of the river into the distillery experience, so that whiskey making and the landscape is woven into one holistic narrative, in a way creating a heritage based on nature, based on the land itself. So you see that mountain. The journey starts here for the visitor. Water is a recurring theme. A water channeled on the left guides everyone through the site. We've kept the existing landscape structure, and you can kind of see sort of the huge distillery. So how do you embed this? By actually elevating some of the elevation so the building is not so large by nature, submerging them to the ground. The testing center is right in the middle. They also want an image for this particular distillery. So these are all quite rendering. This is a construction. This was just about 2 months ago. You will sort of see what we're trying to do. Not quite done yet. Will be done in 2 months. And so I'm just going to show you some of these images, some of the interior shots of this particular project. The shape of the dome rises and comes to a soft crest, alluding to the shape of the Emeisan peak. The two complement and dialogue with each other. The concentric rings and step layers allude to the rippling of water, the originating source of our whiskey spreading across the site from this central point at the heart of the project. So looking back, you see the distillery. And at the end, we actually frame the mountain. So the courtyard of the restaurant that leads you back to nature actually frames the Emeisan, the sacredness of this. And you will be able to see this. There is a video of the construction site here, which I will show you. Again, this was taken about 3 months ago, and things have changed by now, but the dome has really rises above. And in many ways, we've really taken on the formwork of nature and create a new architecture that is submerged with nature, something that is hard, dealing with the softness of the water, coming together, bringing them together and recreating something new. Using local materials, local laborers that understand the lay of the land, the way they use the stone, and at the same time also have certain walls that have a new way of interpreting the stones. This is a new way of interpreting the stones, wherein the mortar is stronger than the stone, to actually stones that are built traditionally and having roof We call it wapian. Actually, very simple way of doing layering to bring back sort of scale down the monolith of this big building. So that's just a snippet. This is very good. It's not done yet, so I have a good excuse to go to Buenos Aires and be able to see you and show you this project when it's final. The last project I want to show you is a project by a client that bought this huge property 3 hours east of Beijing. It's called Qinghuangdao. It's a seaside resort, and his argument is many people in the city needs a place of reprieve, a place that they can go to during the hectic sort of weekly rat race in the city. And he's a developer that has bought like 4 or 5 properties that's always about 3 hours away from major cities. We are now working on a second project with him, but this is our first project. So if you know this particular developer, in this particular site, there's this beautiful seaside, and he's hired people like Vector architects, people like open architecture, and they've always done, all their buildings are along the waterfront. So there's this beach resort, so there's a library, there's a chapel, and there's a museum. And so when he asked me and called me and says, I'd like you to do an art center, I was really excited because I thought I would have this beautiful beach resort. Well, I flew there and he's like, no, yours is not in the beach resort. Yours is actually in the middle of a city on top of the beach resort. And I was a little bit shocked. And he says, well, it is on an old Mediterranean, not exactly a real Mediterranean, a fake Mediterranean village I created. I'm like, yeah, this is absolutely crazy. This is no longer the context I'm interested in, nor do I understand. So how do you deal with a building that have to deal with sort of the fakeness of the context? It's easy when you're talking about nature, you're doing nature, but all of a sudden, if your context is not natural anymore, it's actually this fake condition. We decided, why not? We decided to do a perimeter around it and create a void around it and bring nature into this particular sort of center of the building. And so these are some of the sketches drawing inspiration from the seasonal ocean waters nearby, a sewer and calm in the summer, splintered ice through winter. The building design attempts to encapsulate the natural wonder of water at its core. We decide that the journey that brings you up becomes that spectacle and make it an introverted space. There's nothing else we can do. There's no context that we thought was worth addressing. So we decided to create this facade by having different texture outside, and you sort of see sort of this monolith that starts to become the perimeter of the building from the corner, the entrance. You see sort of the floor plan, and within you cut this beautiful thing and brings nature into the core of this particular space. This is an art gallery that when empty is filled with water, and when there's an event, it's extremely popular now. There's so many outdoor events that brings. So by doing this, the functional, it's more than just the functional aspect of art viewing. It's also nature viewing. We see this space as the core of this project. As I said, it's the center pool area that gathers the community for concert and dramas and other function for gathering. There is a movie I want to show you. So the idea of this future artifact for us, you can imagine that perhaps the context around us one day disappears just because it's perhaps not built very well. Hopefully this becomes that rock, that relic, that ruin that could inform possibilities. Perhaps what the Colosseum did in Rome had this in mind. and it is not an arrogant attitude. It is not an attitude that, yes, we are building something that will have a sense of permanence more than the surrounding building, but perhaps an attention to detail, an attention to the possibility of a future that could become a relic that can inform of the past. As a practice, we always believe what Antoine de Saint-Exupéry says: we do not aspire to be eternal beings. We only hope that things do not lose its meaning and purpose. It's important, whether you're dealing with the past, we're dealing with the present, or dealing with the future, that purpose and meaning should be the central figure of what we do. And I think as architect, I think this is very important. And we're extremely happy. This is our second monograph, which will be released in about a month. And all the seven issues will be addressed there. We're extremely thrilled. Rafael Moneo and Sarah Whiting actually contributed to the opening of this book. So we're extremely excited, extremely thrilled, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you, Lyndon. It was so inspiring, and as the word in Chinese that has in its own meaning the kind of the contradictory, I personally feel so close and of course so far culturally looks so different, but it's so familiar that I have to say that it's much more familiar than many Western countries what you are doing than. So it's really inspiring your lecture. I feel it's so comfortable with your thoughts, especially with the fact of bringing the culture and the past to the present. It's not, as we call it, nostalgia, but in a way it's a good nostalgia. It's a way of keeping the culture and not be erased by basically the neoliberal kind of a culture that in a way only quantify things, no, not qualify things. So when you see all the amount of square meters built, erasing the roots, erasing what is local, and try to be everything like a known place, is kind of sad, because as you say in that amazing picture where I imagine that in Chinese says it was destroyed, there's many books here in Argentina that shows what has been destroyed is, and also this kind of thing that has been destroyed are absolutely impossible, even for economical reasons, to be rebuilt. So they are replaced by much worse things. So what is kept in the city is basically a known places. So we have to resist and be critical in order to try to be, of course, global, but we have to be local too, no? In this kind of apparently contradictory work. But I think that is some certain path that is you're able to be both local and global at the same time. So I felt it very, very inspiring, and I'm very close to our cosmovision of what we are teaching at the University of La Plata and Buenos Aires. So in my personal view, I'm so thankful. I'm so happy that we decide to bring you here, at least in this kind of non-physical way. But of course, we are going to bring you here in a physical way as soon as this pandemic is over. So I wish someone wants to make a question. If you can do it in English, I will translate it to Spanish or vice versa. Everybody wants. Jaime.
First of all, Lyndon, I want to, I appreciate very much your, and also like Danny, I feel very close to your thinking. No, my question is about your experience in Michael Graves' office. How can you tell us the influence of Michael Graves in your work?
Let me start. Obviously, Rafael Moneo, let me start by talking about the fact that Rafael Moneo was my thesis advisor at Harvard. And my 3 years there, he was the central figure of everything we do. There were two camps. There was the sort of Rem Koolhaas OMA camp, and there was the Moneo camp. I think Danny knows that very well. I happen to be in the Moneo camp. Not that I don't like OMA, because I actually have a lot of respect for what Rem does. But the idea of actually history, the idea of context was really important as a foundation for me. But what was interesting is when I worked for Michael Graves, he actually has the same set of values as Raphael. The vocabulary, the things he uses are very different, but he talks about typology. So if you actually think of, and Raphael would visit him, Peter Eisenman would visit him, people with different polar opposite views would visit Michael, and yet they can talk about issues in a civil way. Now, their representation, the way they do things, in terms of their expression are very different. But what I actually learned a lot from Michael Graves, and people often ask me these questions like, you've been at Michael Graves for 10 years and you were quite senior over there. What happened? You know, there's no trace of Michael Graves. Actually, if you look closely, there is. The idea of typology, the importance of typology, the idea of, you know, understanding history. Granting my expression is very different, and most importantly, the multidisciplinary nature of what we do. We do interiors. We do actually a lot of furniture. We design for over 30 European brands. We're probably, I would argue, the most prolific Asian architects practicing in Europe for brands like Artemide, for Cassina, you know, for Classicon. You can name all the brands from German to Italian, all these brands, and of course all the Chinese brands. That I think I learned from Michael Graves, and I realized that that influence actually was very strong. The idea to be able to see architecture, interior, and product design holistically.
There's a couple of questions here in the chat. Let me start to read some. What do you think are the challenges to our students and future generations of architects who will have to face?
I think the challenge today is the immediacy of everything. We have access through Twitter, to Instagram, through WhatsApp, through Facebook, through the internet media, the immediacy of many images, so fast, so quick, that people don't understand section, people don't understand plan. The technological apparatus that we have today deals with SketchUp, Revit, and so everyone is so facile that people don't really appreciate elevation, section, and floor plan. And the discipline of it, the discipline of building models and to understand scale and proportion is rather alarming, because everything is so fast and people are designing from axonometric, like as if architecture is designed from the plane. And that to me is very dangerous, because the materiality, how things are put together, tactility, spatial experience that really deals with humanity and the very experience of what architecture should be, is missing in many, not just schools, but in a lot of practices. I was just in review today, and I told a number of very brilliant students in my studio, I said, you guys are very good in form making, but you really don't understand space. I was quite disappointed. I was not upset, but I made my disappointment clear. And this is the biggest challenge for students today, to actually have the rigor and the discipline to say, can I look at the floor plan? Can I look at the Renaissance from Borromini and Bernini? Or I can look at the work of Palladio, or I look at the modern movement and look at Miguel Roca, or the work of Le Corbusier or Louis Kahn, and actually understand the floor plan and not just an image, a perspective, an aerial view. And people try to then use those images and create something without really understanding the complexity of the project.
There's another question. Do you think the concrete jungle buildings will survive being demolished and will be able to adopt new programs?
When I don't know about the concrete jungle buildings, I think is that I suppose they mean the concrete jungle buildings here in China and also major Asian cities. I certainly hope so. I think the recent Pritzker Prize winner, Lacaton Vassal, talks about the idea of recycling, the idea of not demolishing building, and I could not agree with them more. I do believe that there is life to buildings, and just because they're old, just because they're dilapidated, I think from a sustainability point of view, I think there is a way to adapt them, reuse them, and instead of just constantly demolishing, I think there should be a way of adapting them. Granting some of them are built so fast and structurally not sound, and not efficient. Yes, there are some. I'm not suggesting that we keep everything, because we can't also keep garbage. There should be a way to kind of mitigate this and not just have the idea of demolition as the first gesture.
Fantastic. I don't know if someone else wants to make a question, or maybe Marco, you can read it through the YouTube link and see if there is any question in the chat of the YouTube, because I'm not able to see it.
Yes, we have a question from Sebastian. He says he would like to know a little bit more about the particularities about the Chinese culture, and especially about the ones that are not quite positive.
I think in every society, there's always things that are not positive. I think, however, I would argue the idea that I talked about, which is destruction, which is a common problem in first world country, the idea of just demolishing everything. I think that's a big problem. I think that happened 10 years ago. Things have changed now. I think the government is making a concerted effort to really change. There are other issues that perhaps is portrayed inaccurately. Questions on human rights, for instance, things of how you deal with Tibet and other countries. Sometimes I feel like people need to come to China to understand. I think it's important to be able to be in this land to really understand it, rather than just understand it from sort of an outside perspective and rely on the marketing rhetoric of certain countries. I will leave it at that. I think most of you understand where I'm coming from. Yeah.
Marco, there is any other question?
No, we don't have any more questions on YouTube.
Here we have one more. As a very young nation, we are what? As a very young nation we are. What do you think we have to pay attention in our cities for the future in the way of knowledge or legacy for the better cities?
I think what's important is to understand the social construct of your community. I believe that oftentimes a planning of the city is not just limited to a few people, contrary to what a lot of people think. Just because you're knowledgeable, just because you're educated, doesn't mean that you have the power to be able to dictate policies. I believe in the importance of community and the voices of community. There are people who are actually living and understanding sort of the lay of the land. I think that's important, to be able to hear a more democratic voice around the community that you live in. I think that will allow you to be able to move forward history is very important to us, and I believe history will be important to you as a nation, to be able to look back and be able to understand precedent and not just always looking at the new, but also looking at the past. I'm not saying to completely negate the new, but to actually have that balance as you move forward. I think it's crucial.
Okay, I think it's fantastic. Let me say something that we talked in privately before that made me think a lot and has to do a lot with this lecture. You said that in China we treat our parents and we don't send them to elderly house, but we keep it at home, no? And in a way, it has to do what we are doing in architecture. We keep it as part and not put it behind or underneath the racks. And this is also shows maybe the cosmovision that has to do with the history. No, you deal with history as you deal with your parents, and that's this thing is very important. So we are. So I'm very very shocked and thankful for this lecture, and I hope that we will bring you here to have an asado. I've been in China 2 years ago, and actually we have a teacher that she's living in China, in Chengdu, and she's there for the last 4 or 5 years. She's a great teacher of our class of Taller Explora, of the Cátedra Explora. So she might go to say you hi in some days.
Yes,
so thank you very
definitely.
much, Lyndon. It's been a pleasure. And I hope that we'll see you soon there or here, but that definitely is going to happen. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think I've been to Buenos Aires. It was a beautiful city. That was over 5 years ago. And I really want to be, both Rosanna and I love the city, and we want to be able to go back.
Okay. Thank you very much, Lyndon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.